took the exhaust off and the axle's out, there is plenty of room to work up here. So in order to remove the starter, it looks like there is a bolt up there. That one actually looks fairly small, looks like a 10mm. It's not this bolt, it's above it at the base of the starter. And then there is a screw up there, which I imagine is going to be coming from the other side. And there's the ground for the starter, and that gets bolted on right there. There's a little cover up here, this little plastic dome. It's just a rubber cover, and then there's your post for your starter up there. The intake manifold bracket, these are your Egr solenoids down here. There's two of them, vent and vacuum, and those are attached to your intake manifold bracket, which has never been connected on the bottom. Thanks, random mechanic, whoever decided that was wise. There's a bolt up here, and once you get that out, this whole bracket will just come out. That should make it a little bit easier to push all these solenoids and everything out of the way so you can get even more room. 14mm on that lower starter bolt. That was not in there very tight at all. That was in there pretty loose, actually. Just hand tighten. It's a good size bolt. Yeah, 15 it is. Probably because I replaced it with a 15mm. That's a pain in the ass. They're actually on. I didn't have to take that bracket off. Oh, that's pretty gay. What I could do is just disconnect the EGR sensors. Oh, but they're bolted in. Is that going to give me any more room? Either way. Yeah, there we go. I just stuffed that over there. For those of you who have never seen the bottom of the intake manifold from this angle, I'll just go around and tell you what some of the components are. There's your oil filter, and just up and to the left of that is your oil pressure switch. That's what sends your oil pressure readings to your instrument cluster. Here's where the back of your EGR pipe plugs into your intake manifold. This is your alternator. On the i4, on the V6, the alternator will be here near where the power steering pump is. But on ours, it's in the back. This one right here is your heater hose. I don't know which one is the supply and which one is the return. And those get plugged into the firewall, and those go into behind the dash to your heater core. Right there is your EGR, the bottom of your EGR. Obviously that's the bottom of your intake manifold. That's a pretty good look at the bracket, the intake manifold bracket. There's two screws, so you can choose one or the other. There are two mounting points on the bottom for the intake manifold bracket. There's one there and one there, and you can choose either one. I would recommend this one and the one on the right side, so that makes it kind of a straight shot down there. Obviously this is your starter, and up there where you can't really see it is your starter solenoid. On top, oh, there's a good look inside the axle for you, or probably through the axle, but I can't see it because I can't lift my neck up that far. So continuing on with the starter, that bolt there is gonna have to be gotten to from the top, so let's go up to the top. Here you can see that's a large transmission mount bolt, mounts the transmission to the engine, and that's probably going to be a 17mm. And over here we have a much smaller one. That's probably going to be a 14mm, and that's actually mounting the starter. There's the starter right there. So you have two mount bolts on this side, one there, and then one right there. And you're gonna have to pull all this harness crap out of the way in order to get to those. If you're just wanting to remove the starter, yeah, you're probably gonna have to remove your filter box and all of this and disconnect this harness so that you can lift this harness up and pull and drag it out of the way just enough to get to that bolt over there. Otherwise, I really don't see, I don't see you being able to get to that otherwise. And there's a second bolt to the starter. And that starter is most definitely loose. You could probably just pull it right down from the bottom. I would recommend doing those two bolts first and then the one on the bottom last. Definitely easiest. Otherwise, you're working with a loose starter while you're trying to get those bolts out and it's putting pressure on it. That sucks. Let's go under the car and take it out. I'm going to put my safety glasses on for this because I'm sure some gunk and stuff is going to drop. I'll try and swing my head out of the way for this. Oh, one-handed. Check me out. Sorry, compadre. I must put you down for a minute. There are two wires. One's a control wire, I think. Oh god, I took out the wrong one. That comes from the starter, straight to the starter. There's still this black wire here. It has to come off. Got it. Ta-da! Starter. Good stuff. It's pretty hard to forget that this goes to the starter though. Both of these. Now I'm inclined to try and get the speed sensor up. Pity the fool got a problem with that. There's no room. Can you see this? This is a 10mm hex head, but I can't get a ratchet on it. Oh wait, maybe I can. Oh, come on. Oh. So close. Get on there. Oh, there. Gotcha. Oh man, that's going to be a painfully long process. I think it would be better with a wrench, 10mm wrench. Unfortunately, I don't have a 10mm wrench because it got lost somewhere a long time ago, mind you, years ago. I just never had one. So everything I need a 10mm wrench for, I think is a ratchet. And why am I doing it like this? Because I can't get a grip on it, and it won't go otherwise. Ta-da! This is the speed sensor when it's installed and it's in its correct position. There's another screw that goes down through here, obviously. When it is in this position, it is pointing straight up towards the mount. You move it all the way over to this position so that you can see the clip right here, and suddenly it's pointing off in that direction. And the mount is there, and now it's pointing kind of in that direction back there. And that should be enough to get the clip off, and I can't record. There's just not enough space. I can't record that at the same time while I pull it out. Yep, that came off as easy as I thought it would. I imagine I have to pull that out. So I'm going to try and pull it out and get back with you. Let's take a closer look at the starter, shall we? This is your starter motor, and this is your starter solenoid. And then remove those two screws there, and you can replace the solenoid. You can get the solenoid from just about any auto parts store. And there is a positive terminal, which is a copper one in this case. And your signal to start the starter would come in on this wire. You can repair a starter motor if you want to take it apart. Brian's Mobile has a great video on starter repair. Let's go back to the old ages. Let's say, you know, the 1800s or early 1900s or whenever the hell cars were first made. You had a hand crank on the front of the engine. You've seen those old cars with the hand crank like that. And that's where the term crank comes from, because you had to manually crank the car engine over in order to get it to jump start. And this is actually short for jump starter. A better example would be a motorcycle. It's got that long kickstarter on it, and you would kickstart your motorcycle. Well, this is all done electronically in a car. So you have your starter hooked up, so you don't have to crank it, and it would send an electronic signal to the starter, and that would crank the engine over. And it does this temporarily with this cog, this big cog on here, and this will slide down, engage the pressure plate on an automatic or a flywheel on a manual transmission. That flywheel is huge, you know, it's probably about 18 inches around, and that's what those cogs fit into, the flywheel or pressure plate. So that would kickstart your engine, and then when it's done, it only happens momentarily. When it's done, it releases and pops back into place. This actually turns the flywheel or pressure plate. Then when it's done, it flips back in. Now sometimes these are known to stick, so it'll stay in place and it won't disengage, and usually you can tell when that happens. Serious lack of power will make a real funny noise, probably a real high-pitched whine. Not to be confused with an alternator whine, or it might not even go. It might just engage, and that's it. You can't crank your engine over by hand. If you put a socket on the crank, you try and crank it over, some crap mechanic might say, well, your engine is toast. You know, the pistons have stuck. You've overheated your car and burnt up your pistons so that they're stuck in the cylinder bores. No, it's just a stuck starter. And there are many other things that a stuck starter, you know, bad solenoid, bad motor, won't engage, won't disengage. There's a couple different things to go on with the starter, but you can look those up online. Like I said, I'm not a mechanic, so don't take my word for it. Do your own research. As far as the transmission bolts are concerned, I'm pretty sure that I've gotten them all, and the only thing left to do is to get the 2 bolts at the top plus the mounting bolt, and we should be dropping it real soon. Alright, now I'm pretty sure that the only bolts left to get is this big one here. It's probably going to be a 19mm, and again another one 19mm, and then one over there. So 3 bolts left. 3. Alright, there's only one thing left to do, and that's remove the 3 bolts and the mount. I'm going to go with the mount first. Yeah. Alright, now just to get a hammer and punch it through. Once you punch it through, it's probably not going to punch through the whole way. So, get a pry bar, get on the edge of the nut there, and just try and pry it out as far as you can. And that's basically the same exact process as the rear mount bolt, but the rear mount bolt's a lot harder. And then if you need to, you've got plenty of space here where you can just turn this around, fit it on the edge there, and then hit it with a hammer to smack it out. And this is your transmission bolt. As you can see, as I was saying, it's square on one side, and then there's a little tab that rests up against it so that it can't turn. It comes with a big old nut. Then put that in your bag with all your other mounts.
Been working on it all day, huh?
Today, yeah, probably for the past week. Well, it's been raining so much that I haven't really been able to get to it. I'm going to try and dislodge it by jacking the jack up, and maybe it'll crack open those seams, because right now it shouldn't be connected to the engine, so if I pull it up, it might crack that seal. Because the mounts are kind of like pinched, let's say something like that, after a while they're constricted and they're still pinched and they're grabbing it. Even though the bolt isn't out, you have to kind of pry those sides out. Jack moved. Here are the removal steps for removing the transmission. You're supposed to use this hanger bar to support the engine while you drop the transmission. Instead of this, I have the crane. Support the transmission on a jack. Remove the transmission mounting bolts. Remove the transmission. That is it. That's all it says for removing the transmission. Well, I've been at it for about an hour, prying and jumping up and down on the transmission, and I know there isn't a bolt. I've looked. I'm not missing a bolt, but it's just not coming loose. I have no idea why. I think it's because that rear mount is catching, and it's just not sliding down off that rear mount. Well, I figured why not just try and remove the entire trans mount. And of course, ran into some problems. There are 2 long studs that come up out of here, and if you try and lift this mount, I've lifted the mount, but as you can see, the studs are just barely sticking through, and I can't get it up above that, which means you have to lower the transmission just a hair, you know, maybe about 1 more inch in order to bring this up. The problem is that my transmission won't lower. Whole thing. I don't understand why. It just won't lower. Alright, I finally got it to lower a little bit. I think my problem was that I forgot that I had this jacked up a little bit, so I relieved the pressure on the jack, lowered the crane a little bit, and now I was able to push on this just enough to get it to lower. So now I have it lower enough where I can rotate this mount out and hopefully just pull it right out. this thing should be dropping, and it's not. And you can see the seam there. It's the metal gasket, which first I would have never thought there'd be a metal gasket, but there's a metal gasket. It's not enough to get a pry bar on or anything in there to move it, so that's where I'm at. Last night I had the idea that this transmission mount, even though the bolt is removed, the actual bracket is still on there. And in order to remove the transmission, which is still attached to that bracket, you need to move the transmission forward off of the flywheel or flex plate, and off the spindle and the torque converter and all that. You need to go forward with it, but you can't because this bracket won't let you go forward. So you need to either drop it down or raise it up, and you can't drop it down far enough. It just won't let me drop it down far enough. Last night I got really frustrated and made a frustrating post, and Monoxide Child, Zepticon, and Prince Valorum all gave me some great ideas. Zepticon, I think, was the one that said there's guide pins. Monoxide Child said there's an inspection cover on the bottom, which there isn't an inspection cover on the ATX, it's on the MTX. But I was able to see this when I removed the intake manifold. My thought process was I need the intake manifold removed in order to get that bracket out. When I removed that bracket, I could see through the starter, which I couldn't see through before because the intake manifold and everything was in here, and I was doing it from the bottom. So once you get the intake manifold out, you can see in there, you can see your flex plate, you can see your flex plate screws that go in there. And what you have to do is put your breaker bar on the crank pulley bolt, crank it over, and that will spin the flex plate in there and will reveal the screws. Let me get a flashlight. There's a screw there, looks like a 12 millimeter, and there's the cogs of the flex plate right there. So those screws will only present themselves when you turn the crank, and that will in turn spin this. And I believe there are 4 bolts that I'm going to have to remove through here, through the starter cover. I kind of figured that out by reading the 5th gen manual. Fortunately, I'm fortunate enough to have a 5th gen manual. And for those of you who haven't seen a 5th gen manual, there's a lot of sections that are much more detailed than the 4th gen manual. Even though it's for an FSDE and not an FS, they're pretty much practically identical engine. There's a lot of different variations, but for the most part, how everything's put together is the same. It laid out an entire table of procedures for transmission removal, whereas the 4th gen manual, the 94, has 3, count them, 3 steps. Unbolt the transmission, drop the transmission, you know, that kind of thing. It's more than vague. But the 5th gen manual goes into saying that you must get into here and remove the torque converter bolts. Now, I don't believe those are torque converter bolts. I believe those are flex plate bolts. And I'm not really sure, but my guess is, since I have access to this, I have to remove those. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but it just kind of feels like the right thing to do. I'm going to completely remove this mount here and all 4 bolts in there. I'd like to say thanks to Fade, who had another good suggestion of just get a good night's sleep and come back at it tomorrow refreshed. Sometimes that's all you need is to clear your head. And that's what I thought of last night, and it's pretty much how I wanted to attack it today. And yeah, I got a new avenue of attack. When I removed the intake manifold, the puzzle basically presented itself, and now all the pieces are seeming to come into view. Okay, there's the mounting bolts, and that one on the right was the one that was giving me the most trouble. And as you can see, the firewall right there is all torn up because there's just no space. It's actually on an angle, it's hard to see, but those bolts are hidden back in there a little bit. And nothing that I would do with my breaker bar, half-inch breaker bar. What actually ended up doing the trick was this extendable half-inch that my brother-in-law gave me, and I don't think that you can buy these or find these anywhere. These were specially made for electrical contracting employees. This is from a substation box that was being decommissioned, and they would have these tied up inside the substation boxes for the workers to use when they had to go out and make changes to switches and stuff like that. And then they would just have this on hand, so they didn't have to, if they didn't have the right tool or something, this was provided for them in the box. But then when they decommissioned them and changed to different systems, these were no longer needed. So a whole bunch of these got distributed out, and I ended up getting one. ND28 ended up getting one too. And these are really nice. As you can see, this breaker bar is much thicker than the 1/4 inch breaker bar and the 1/2 inch breaker bar that I have. And as you can see, that's my 1/2 inch breaker bar, that's my 1/4 inch breaker bar, and that's the length of this 1/2 inch breaker bar. It's much shorter but much thicker, and that was the trick that I needed, because this space in here from the bracket to the back of the engine where the intake manifold, the breaker bars would not, the breaker bars that I had were too long. So that 1/2 inch breaker bar, that shorter 1/2 inch breaker bar, was able to fit into that space, and that's what gave me the leverage I needed. So you need just the right tool for that job. So now I'm going to drop that bracket, and hopefully the engine and the transmission aren't going to drop. Alright, I got all 3 of those bolts out, and I'm ready to take out this this bracket. Now there are 2 studs coming up out of there, so you're going to have to pull straight up. Maybe if I can get down underneath of it and pry up. Oh, that's kind of working. Alright, I found a trick that helped the most, was to actually pry up against this lip and the mount bracket here. Get it up as high as you can, like so. Just keep going up, and then just keep going back down there, and go side to side kind of thing, and pry that up. And then I have the jack underneath the transmission. I don't have a transmission jack, so if it does fall, I don't know if it's centered, so just pray, I guess. Come on. Why does it feel like it's catching on something down there? It's catching on that bolt, that stud. That same right stud being a pain in my ass again. Because that stud sticks up farther than the other 2, I believe. Takes a little bit more effort to get up, but there you go. No, it looks to be about the same height. And the whole point of removing that rear mount is to remove this bracket, because you need this bracket removed, otherwise when you drop it, it's going to hit the steering column shaft, whatever you, shit. Yeah, it's definitely gonna hit the steering rack. So this bracket's got to go. Now we can get that one stupid bolt that was hiding underneath the mount. Okay, finally got the last mounting bolt. So this bracket should come right out. All right, we're back the next day, and I'm gonna go at those drive plate bolts. Okay, I got the first bolt off the flex plate, and this is, the bolts on here are actually 15 millimeter. So only 15 millimeter I know that's on this car. Usually it's going to be 10, 12, 14, 16, or usually it's going to be 10, 12, 14, 16, 19, 21, and then 32 for the axle nut. But this is the first 15 I've come across. 15 on the flex plate. These weird triangle notches, triangular pattern notch on here. Maybe that was from the air gun that installed this nut. I don't know, it's kind of weird though. So that's 1 down, and I suspect 3 more to go. My thought is that the torque converter, that those are actually torque converter bolts, and that the torque converter is bolted to the flex plate. And once you get those 4 bolts off, then you can just push the transmission right off. I hope so, because if it's not these 4 bolts, then I have no clue what else it could be. And I guess it would help to show exactly how I got this off. 15 mil socket on there. You can take the EGR pipe out if you want. It's probably going to make it easier, but you can work around it. You get that on there nice and tight, and you will need a U-joint on here because the block will get in the way from making this perfectly straight, and it's just enough so that you can't get it on there. So you need a little U-joint, and then that'll free you up for a lot of different play. And then I took this, went straight up with it. Then I put my breaker extension on it so that I got the leverage and cracked it loose. But this one was probably the second hardest to the rear mount bolts. These things are on there good, probably because the entire weight of the transmission is just resting on those 4 bolts. I'm sure it would be much easier to do this particular one out of any other bolt in the car. I think is designed to be removed with an air gun or an air wrench, and probably a wobble socket or an impact U-joint kind of thing. Doing it with hand tools is a real pain in the ass. The threads that are bolted to the torque converter are Loctited in place. The same thing as the manual flywheel, where you use Loctite on it, preferably red or blue Loctite, I believe. Now the torque specs for this are pretty low, but it's misleading because that additional Loctite is used. It kind of raises the torque, it artificially inflates the torque value kind of thing. So you're probably looking at about 75 pounds of torque in order to break that Loctite. And then once you break that Loctite, it's just like spinning off any other bolt in the car. It just comes off real easy. But breaking that Loctite is pretty hard. While you're trying to break this free, while you're pulling down on your ratchet, the flex plate wants to move down with it. So I've actually gotten lucky where there's this little ridge right here that the head of my ratchet will sit right on, and I can use that as a leverage point. And once you have that nut spun off a little bit to the point where it will freely spin and your ratchet no more has any ratcheting action, then you come in here with your fingers really lightly. Ta-da! That's 2. In order to find the next nut, you have to keep an eye on it while you turn the crank pulley bolt on the breaker bar. So I'm gonna spin that, and you'll see that it spins around pretty fast, so you have to keep an eye on it. You want to line that up directly in the middle there. Directly in the middle, that when you get your socket on it, there won't be any free play, and that will give you the maximum amount of room to play with. An oversized hole on the right here, right there, and I imagine that's to get a large impact socket on there. Right here there is sort of an extrusion coming out of the block that will prevent you from getting a straight shot on it, which kind of sucks, but that means that you're going to have to use a universal joint, either with an impact gun or with hand tools. So there's your next bolt, and just keep going at it. Okay, well, I got the last bolt out, but that last bolt took me quite a while. Thing is really seriously mangled. I ended up stripping it, and then I was like, well, I'm screwed. So I ended up going up to the local auto parts store and picking out this bolt out set. This one happens to be an Irwin bolt out set, and even though the bolt is 15 millimeters, this one comes with a 14 millimeter socket. Because it's rounded, the 14 millimeter socket fit right on there. If you go to, let's say you strip your bolt and you go to pick up a 15 millimeter socket or a 15 millimeter bolt out, it's not going to work because you've already stripped it. You need to go size smaller, so go with the 14 millimeter. And man, that just got it right out. I just want to say, while it's fresh in my mind, that without that bolt out set that I got, the Irwin bolt out set, I would have been screwed. There would have been absolutely no way to get that nut off once I stripped it. So if you ever get a strip bolt head or a nut, get a bolt out kit. That thing works amazing. Alright, now we are underneath of the transmission, and there are these little black plugs, which I mentioned earlier. And I didn't really think much of it. They're just kind of like seal plugs, and if you look directly under it, you'll notice that there's part of the wheel there. My guess is I'm going to have to rotate the wheel until something presents itself, and then stick like a socket or something up in there to remove some bolts or something like that. It's on the jack on this side, so if it does actually slide off, which it's not because there's an axle there, but it'll end up sliding right down my face, which is like one of my nightmares. So just don't put yourself in this position and do this step first. Alright, well, while I was under here, I had my brother-in-law move the crank pulley. I have a breaker bar over there, and he just rotated around, and this little yellow thing in there, I don't know what that is, it did not move, so it's not part of the wheel. And while I was down here, you know, looking for the reason maybe why it's not splitting, of course I come to that. Look at that. It makes so much sense because it's splitting on the top, but it's not splitting on the bottom. So I got one more bolt, and that looks like a, what are you gonna guess? 14 millimeter. And after that 14 millimeter bolt was out, of course, it just split like an egg. Right onto the jack stand, which is down over there. I can't really see how far that shaft goes, or actually I can't even see the shaft. I can see that drive plate separated pretty cleanly so far. About the only thing I think that I'm really worried about right now is that axle and these dowel pins. I do not want to mess up these dowel pins, because with my engine rebuild, you mess up a dowel pin, you're gonna have a bad day. In order to drop it so those dowel pins don't get real marred, might need 2 jacks. Now I think I'm going to put you up on a tripod. Alright, it's starting to rain a little bit, but I want to get this done tonight. Okay, right here is where the split is in the transmission, and that's where I'm going to be prying. And actually, since the transmission is on a jack about right here, this whole thing will probably end up leaning forward. I don't have the jack position right, and if I lower that jack anymore, the whole thing's just going to fall off. So I didn't have my jack position right. I can't take this off to put that back on. You know, that's just not going to work. So what I'm going to do is raise up this end of the transmission a little bit, and then use the jack and basically just pull it away, because all the weight is on the jack. I don't even need the pry bar. No axle on the engine side. The torque converter is on the transmission side, and there's no axle or anything sticking out. So I should just be able to drop this cleanly. Okay, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this in the dark, so just for reference, this is where the gap is right now. Just hope it doesn't fall. But if it does, you're going to see it. Whoa, my jack is pulling out. Yeah, and it's the whole transmission is scraping on the flywheel as it's coming down. But my jack is now only on the transmission about halfway. My jack is going to end up slipping off of the transmission, and the transmission is going to fall. It's going to fall. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Cool. Alright, there goes on my harness. Nope. Oh, look at that. Got a torque converter surprise. Oh, and some transmission fluid with it. Yep. Everything looks okay though. Control arms are still okay. There's a lot of all the transmission fluid that was in the torque converter, I'm guessing, is now spilling out. So what I have to do now is raise up the front end of the car with jacks, just jack it up a little bit higher, and then try and drag it out. That's where the transmission fluid came spilling out, and I just drug the transmission right through where I wanted to, so that kind of works out. I'm guessing the transmission fluid spilled out of the axles. But yeah, there's a spindle behind the torque converter, And that doesn't even get to the other side, so you don't have to worry about bending that axle. And even if you do, you want to swap it out, so that's not the part on the side that you want to keep. Alright, now I just need to get that torque converter out of there. Get some good purchase here. Oh, it's actually back heavy. Oh, God. Whoa. Well, that's kind of crazy. Didn't expect that. Wow. That's different. Alright. I am strong, man. That's fucking heavy. Well, got it a couple feet. Yeah. Not 200-300 pounds. More like 120, 130. It's up there. Definitely heavier than the manual transmission, because I've carried the manual transmission myself. Probably about 200 yards. That I can only carry, if it was a strongman competition and I had to, max 10 feet. That thing is fucking heavy. And I have to carry it over there, so 10 feet. Yeah. This torque converter ain't no joke either. That's why it's so heavy. Try and lift that transmission with this torque converter, now you're talking 200 pounds. I don't know what part this is going to encompass, part 3 or part 4. This part is definitely done. Just in time, huh?